good, Porgy.
Look at that smile you got.
What you been up to?
Nothing.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Well, for a cold night, that's a warm reception. Thank you very much. I'm Joe Gary, and I am delighted to welcome you to Broadway Buzz. We have an extraordinary show tonight, Porgy and Bess. In 2010, Porgy and Bess celebrated its 75th anniversary. It has played in every major theater center in the world. It has played in major opera companies all over the world. It's an extraordinary work that has always been followed by a bit of controversy. Let me just quickly sort of outline that for you. In its original production in 1935, the work was, no one could decide what it was. The New York critics were very on the fence, and they couldn't decide if it was an opera or a musical. And so the lead critic from the New York Times wrote a very indifferent review about the show, and then all of his colleagues followed with rave reviews. So obviously he had to save face, and he did a think piece, a Sunday piece, in which he said, yes, of course, it really is a great work. I forgot to say that. But is it really a musical or an opera? Well, if they'd only looked at the subtitle, Mr. Gershwin called it Porgy and Bess, a folk opera. So it was very clear what the work really was. But it's taken all these years to decide whether it is opera or musical theater. And in fact, what it is of course, a unique and special hybrid. The production would go on to in numerous productions literally everywhere in the world. I first saw the show when I was 10 years old, and I can't really quite tell you what I thought the show was about, but it had this incredible passion. And the lyrics and music were so powerful that even in a 10-year-old's mind, you know, the lyrics became almost verbatim, and those tunes stay with you all your life. It has the quality of opera in that it has the passion and the bigness and the fullness to literally stir our souls. The bottom of all this, whatever we think of the show, is that it has brilliant music. Keep in mind, by the time we got to the 1950s with the show, there were conversations that perhaps the show was racist. And so there was a whole body of discussion about how could white men write about black issues in an insightful way. But what everyone seems to forget is we're talking about a piece of art, and we're talking about brilliant, world-class artists. And really, there is no color when you talk about talent and art. And in fact, what it really is an extraordinary work. So all of its life, it has generated some level of controversy. There was a famous film in 1959. Sidney Poitier was scheduled to star in the film, and he turned it down, saying that it was a racist work. And Sam Goldwyn was the head of the studio, and he said, listen, if you don't do this show, you're never going to work in movies ever again. So somehow the actor found a way of seeing a way of doing the role, and the movie went on. Keep in mind, the movie had some conflict also. The Gershwins were never really happy with the film version of it, and the end result was it was withdrawn. And sadly, because there are some really wonderful things in the film, but the music was very seriously cut, and the Gershwin family felt uncomfortable with it as sort of the defining filmic version of it. So it's very difficult. You can still find a sort of pirated edition of it, but the quality of it is very poor. It needs clearly to be totally remixed and redone. And then, of course, there have been very modern productions of it in South Africa and literally everywhere in the world, where it takes on a resonance and power and brilliance that transforms the audience. Even this modern production that you're seeing tonight won the 2012 Tony Award, but it was a work that was completely sort of reimagined. The music was cut. The original work was almost 4 hours long. You're seeing a show that plays in about 2 hours and 15 minutes. With a 15-minute intermission. So you're seeing a cut version of the show, but the aim is to make it more suitable for a Broadway audience. Some of the text has been altered, some of the arrangements have been reconceived, but what happens in almost every version of Porgy and Bess that you see is it triumphs because the music is so extraordinary. You may remember in 2012, as they were announcing this production for Broadway, there was a very big controversy about it. The artists who were doing the show talked about their vision of the show, and Stephen Sondheim, who is, of course, one of the greatest contributors to the musical theater, took great exception to what they said, and there was a sort of verbal battle in the New York Times for quite a period of time. There were more letters to the editor based on that article than almost any other show in recent memory, and it caused a great deal of controversy. But what finally, when all the dust is settled, what we have is a work that's enormously playable. It deserved to win the Tony Award as the best revival in 2012, and it has just taken a different incarnation. So for us, what I want to do is trace the evolution of this incredible story. It started, first of all, as a novel. It then was presented as a play. It was then presented as a folk opera. The folk opera then, over these 75 years, has been played with, made more like an opera, less like an opera, more like a musical, less like a musical in this period of time. And the end result is it still remains as one of the best examples of the greatest purity of American art form. It's an extraordinary work that is recognized literally everywhere in the world. When they had the debate about is it really opera, I just want to remind you that finally it played at La Scala, and it had one of the longest standing ovations in the history of the Opera House. So I think that attests to the fact that it does have significant operatic qualities to it. And then, of course, it has had over 6 major productions on Broadway in these 75 years, all of them generating an enormous amount of excitement and introducing this masterwork to a different generation. Okay, so let me go back to the beginning and really set the framework for you. This is a very atmospheric show. It takes place in Charleston, South Carolina. And basically what we're dealing with is Gullah. The word Gullah refers to descendants from African slaves who settled along the coast of South Carolina and Georgia. As you may remember in the horrifying story of slavery, when the slaves came to America, and Charleston, of course, was one of the main ports where slaves were sold and distributed through the South, one of the greatest horrors beyond just the notion of slavery was the idea that families were separated and people would arrive and be torn from their fellow tribesmen. And so people were left, these poor people were left not being able to speak a language in common with anyone else. All of their traditions and values were lost. And so we have this horrific story of what happened in terms of slavery. We literally took away the ancestors and the traditions of a group of people, aside from taking away their freedom. So keep in mind, when we use the word Gullah, this is a very interesting notion. Even today, in Charleston, South Carolina, there is a Gullah population. So the Gullah population lives along the coast of South Carolina and Georgia. They're descendants from slaves, and they've been able to maintain their sense of language, tradition, culture, religion, dance, beliefs, crafts, cooking. And so it's one of the only examples of black slaves who have a racial memory. And so that Gullah population is very rich and very potent. And as I said, it still exists. Primarily in those coastal areas of Georgia and South Carolina. There's a great deal of interest in Gullah now as a sort of language. It is a mixture of Creole and English, and it's a kind of patois that is enormously colorful and very lyric and very rich. The language that you hear in the show is based on Gullah. Everything you see in the show is based on the Gullah tradition. Okay, so let me introduce then the originating artist. DuBose Heyward DuBose Hayward was a Southerner growing up in South Carolina. His parents were impoverished, as almost everyone in the South was, from that post-Civil War period. The whole culture was literally destroyed. DuBose Hayward came from a very distinguished Southern family. His great-grandfather had signed the Declaration of Independence, and his forefathers had owned slaves and had large plantations. But by the time DuBose Hayward came along, of course, the family was shattered. There was no income. They had absolutely nothing. His father died when he was a little boy, so his mother was left really penniless, trying to raise two children. And being a very clever woman and being very sensitive to this Gullah population, she started writing poems about the Gullahs and articles for the newspaper about the Gullah tradition. So DuBose Hayward's mother was really one of the first people to sort of adorize this tradition, this black tradition of African culture that still exists almost untouched in terms of Georgia. And so from a very young age, DuBose Hayward learned Gullah as a language before he learned English. So he was enormously sensitized to the people and the traditions of the Gullah tradition, which would make him the perfect commentator to write a story about this. Through his young life, he was ill. He had typhoid, he had polio, he had pleurisy, and so he spent his life sort of being very confined as a young man, and he wrote a great deal, and he wrote poetry also, following his mother's tradition. One of his first jobs as a young man was to work on the docks in South Carolina, where he was literally surrounded by the Gullah tradition and all of the people. He was totally overwhelmed that he came from a culture now, his white Southern upbringing, that was very decayed, that had totally false values. People were living on old traditions that didn't exist anymore. It truly was gone with the wind, the life that his family knew. And so the end result was he was dazzled by the energy and excitement of the black people living in this area that was called Canary Row. And he would name Canary Row in the novel that he writes Catfish Row, and that is the setting for the musical that you will see tonight. So as this young man working as a shipping clerk, he watched these young black stevedores with enormous power and strength and joy of living, really eclipsing the pathetic little sad world he lived in. And he knew that he was going to write some kind of major work about the Gullah tradition. He went through being a poet. He went to writers' colonies where he met his young wife, who incidentally was from Ohio. Her name was Dorothy. She was an aspiring playwright. They married, and at this point, he knew that he had to dedicate himself to writing a novel about the Gullah people. And so he read an article in the Charleston newspaper about this area called Canary Row, and there was this sort of beggar who lived there who drove a little goat cart because he was paralyzed and couldn't walk, and he was called Goat Cart Sammy, and he was accused of shooting a gun. He got drunk and shot a gun at a woman and missed her, but it made a little newspaper item in the paper that Goat Cart Sammy was pursued by the police and arrested. And this so captured the imagination of DuBose Hayward that this would be the basis of his story. He would take Goat Cart Sammy and turn him into a character named Porgy. And so the end result was, in the original novel, Porgy is a cripple who is in a goat cart pulled by two goats. He supports himself by selling things in Canary Row, and this would become the basis for his novel. And it's an extraordinary novel full of passion and pain. He wrote it very painstakingly, and having had this very strong sense of the linguistic subtleties of the people, he wrote this remarkable book. It's a 157-page book, but when you read it, it has a whole world of life in it that is so rich and so compelling and in many ways so foreign to a white reader. Keep in mind, this book was published in 1925, and it caused a major literary sensation. I mean, this would open the door to the other great Southern writers like Tennessee Williams or Truman Capote or Carson McCullers or any number of great writers who would take this idea of looking into the black world and writing about it in some kind of insightful and hopefully sensitive way. So it became a major book in 1925 and a bestseller. Several things would happen after that. And as it makes its journey to being a play and ultimately to being the Gershwin opera, very interesting things happen. I just want to remind you of this idea that an artwork is always in flux. And so many things happen. There are so many backstories that happen that will affect the impact of the work. Keep in mind, immediately, three prominent playwrights at the time, the year is 1925, immediately write to DuBose Hayward saying, we would like the rights to turn this into a play. And he was considering that very seriously. Cecil B. DeMille, who was making silent movies at the time, wanted the rights to do it. And the end result was that the Hollywood studio finally said to Cecil B. DeMille, after sort of finding out the financials of the film, said we could never distribute it in the South because of segregation rules, so therefore we could never make our money back on it. So Cecil B. DeMille withdrew his idea of doing the show. And at the same time, George Gershwin, who was by this point the greatest composer that America had. He had already created countless musicals for the stage. He had done fantastic revues, the George White Scandals. He would go on to have this phenomenal career where he would create both popular music, jazz music. He would create musicals, movies, and also he would create great symphonic works like Rhapsody in Blue, like Concerto in F, like American in Paris. He was an extraordinary and dimensional writer. And like Leonard Bernstein, he would never be satisfied just being a commercial composer. He also wanted to be a classical composer. So he contacted DuBose Hayward saying, I really would like to do an opera of this work. And this would be his big transition, moving from popular musicals to moving to a major, serious piece of musical theater. DuBose Hayward was very torn because, number one, when a property is hot, when you have a book that's a bestseller, you want to sell it to the movies or to whoever is interested as soon as possible so you get the largest sum of money. And just as he was going through this ordeal of making a choice of what he was going to do with the Porgy novel, his wife came forward and said, as you remember, I'm of course a playwright, and I've taken the liberty of taking your book and writing it as a play, making some changes, altering the ending, making some subtle changes that really illuminated the work and made it infinitely more powerful. So the end result was DuBose Hayward was very torn, but obviously here was his wife who had written a play version of it. So he called the Gershwins and said, I really would love to proceed with you, but my wife has written a play version. And George Gershwin said, that's great. It's going to take me years to write the opera. And if I have a clear libretto, if I have a wonderful text to work from, that would make my job so much easier. By all means, let her move ahead with the play version of Porgy. And so that happened. And the Theater Guild, which was one of the most interesting production companies in New York at the time, they had done all of the great classics. They really sort of invented Eugene O'Neill, and they had done all of his great works. And so it was very distinguished to have the Theater Guild interested in presenting this work. But there was a great controversy at this point. There were no trained black actors in 1926. And the Theater Guild couldn't find a suitable director to direct the work, saying, black artists have been trained as singers and dancers. Of course, this is all the period of the Harlem Renaissance. So we have some of the greatest performers in the world being black performing, but we don't have people who are skilled and trained in acting. And so the end result was they ultimately hired a man named Rouben Mamoulian. And Rouben Mamoulian is a very interesting figure. He would go on to have a major career in Hollywood and a major career as a director, and this would be his breakthrough. But the interesting background about Rouben Mamoulian is he was Armenian. His father sent him to Russia to be educated. His father wanted him to be a lawyer, so he sent him to Moscow to be educated. But instead, Rouben Mamoulian studied with Stanislavski. And so he learned about method acting, and he learned about creating modern drama. And long before Elia Kazan would direct all those great Tennessee Williams plays and Arthur Miller plays, and long before Marlon Brando, here is Rouben Mamoulian, who comes to America with all of these skills in terms of working in a very naturalistic, realistic way to work on inner passion, inner belief, inner realities. And all of this, of course, fits perfectly with the Porgy story. So the end result was he was hired to direct the play version of Porgy, which opened in 1927. And it was an enormous sensation. Number one, he took a group of untrained black artists who were basically trained in music. And so he decided if they have an appreciation and sensitivity for music, Stanislavski's work works very much in this way. And I want you to be very aware of it. Even as you see this musical tonight, you will still see this influence of this very believable, naturalistic kind of acting. When Rouben Mamoulian directed this show of actors who had never had to memorize lines, sustain character, recreate emotion on the stage, he stood with the script on a music stand, and it was like he was a conductor. He had a little stick that he would pound on the music stand, and he directed the show. In Stanislavski's language, we talk about the idea of beats, B-E-A-T-S. A beat means the smallest motivational unit. So what Rouben Mamoulian would do would let all of the artists see what the scene was about, what everyone wanted in the scene, how they were going to get what they wanted. That's what a play is always about, conflicting wants. And then he would then break it down the way music would be broken down, beat by beat by beat, or note by note by note. And the end result is the black artists related to this very significantly. And he ended up getting these extraordinary performances that would mesmerize the audience. And this is long before we would have a body of highly realistic work on Broadway. Keep in mind, at this point in the late 20s, acting on Broadway was very bigger than life, very artificial, and suddenly here were these performances that were so naturalistic and so lifelike that the audience was blown away by the experience. So the end result is the Gershwins were thrilled with what had happened to the evolution of Porgy from its novel to its play version, and they then very strongly committed to creating the opera. Now, a couple of things happen at the end of the 1920s. Number one, Showboat opens. And keep in mind, Jerome Kern would totally transform the musical. As you remember, it's a musical about race, white and black, about people living on a showboat, but it's done in a very realistic way with very organic music and lyrics that are very right for the character and situation. So this would create a totally new frame for how Broadway musicals should be done. And George Gershwin was very smart to understand that very dimensionally. But then the other thing that would happen in the late 1920s is the stock market crashed. So DuBose Hayward lost everything. He suddenly had no money, and he had this incredible property, but he was desperate for money. He didn't even have money to live on. And so other people started coming to him saying, we'd like to do this as a musical. One was Jerome Kern, and he was going to do it for Al Jolson, who was going to play Porgy in blackface. And happily, DuBose Hayward turned that offer down and waited, even through the very lean years of what was then a serious depression, to wait for the Gershwins to finish their work. They very significantly worked on the work from 1933 to 1935. Gershwin spent 2 years composing that brilliant score, and then he did the entire arrangement himself. He spent more time doing the arrangements than he did the music. So here we are, 1935, Porgy and Bess opens on Broadway. Right before it goes to Broadway, it's 4 hours long. It's much too long. They make very quick cuts in the show so that they get it down to about 3 hours and 15 minutes. The show opens to, as I told you, mixed reviews, but substantially what happened was it became a classic really overnight. And the audience understood that they were in the presence of some of the greatest music ever written for the musical theater. Very happily, DuBose Hayward wrote some of the lyrics along with Ira Gershwin for this show. Probably one of the most singularly important songs ever sung on the Broadway stage is Summertime. And the lyrics for that show, excuse me, the lyrics for that show, of course, were written by DuBose Hayward. Keep in mind, over 30,000 artists have recorded Summertime. So the end result is the show opened. It was a triumph. It had a tour. There were countless productions of the show. It went back to Broadway, where they stripped it down, stripped the orchestra in half, stopped some of the singing recitatifs, and had spoken dialogue, so it was more like a musical. And the show was played with over the years until we find so many different versions of the show. You know, remember, of course, you can't think about this brilliant score without thinking about Nina Simone and her interpretation of some of the songs, or Ella Fitzgerald, or Miles Davis. So one of the things I want you to be aware of is that music is eclectic, and music can be changed and reinterpreted, and that's what's happened with this version. Remember, George Gershwin died 2 years after Porgy and Bess opened, so he never really had the opportunity that most composers really have of reworking and retooling their work. So other artists have had to do it over this long history. So you're now seeing a production that's directed by Diane Paulus. You know her work from Hair. Most recently, she just won the Tony Award for Pippin. Everything she touches seems to turn to gold right now. She works at American Repertory Theater at Harvard, and it's created an enormous body of important commercial works. So the end result is you're seeing yet another incarnation of Porgy and Bess. And even though you may remember the Houston Grand Opera, brilliant version of it that was done in the 70s, or the Lauren Moselle version that was done at Severance Hall, where all 599 pages of the score were sung. It took over 4 hours to hear it. There are these landmark productions that have dealt with the show in its entirety and stripping it down, and this is one more version of it that adds to the majesty of this extraordinary work. So I think you're in for a very special experience. Thank you. Thank you.
I got my song, got him the whole day long, got my girl.